When Mark Thompson was sentenced to 5 years at the Old Fenwick Penitentiary for a crime he didn't commit, he thought that the worst thing he would have to deal with was the loneliness and monotony of prison life. However, upon his arrival, he quickly realized that Fenwick was no ordinary prison. The ancient stone walls, the eerie echoing of distant footsteps, and the shadows that seemed to move of their own accord told Mark that this place held secrets darker than the hearts of its inmates. Mark was assigned to cell block D, a section of the prison that even the guards seemed reluctant to patrol after dark. His cellmate was a man known only as Carter, a convicted hitman with cold, calculating eyes and a reputation that kept even the hardest criminals at bay. Carter rarely spoke, and when he did, his voice was a rasping whisper that sent shivers down Mark's spine. On Mark's first night, the lights flickered and went out as a thunderstorm raged outside, plunging the cell into darkness. In the shadows, Carter's voice broke the silence. "You believe in ghosts, Mark?" he asked, his tone oddly serious. Mark, trying to keep his voice steady, replied, "No, I can't say that I do." Carter chuckled, a sound devoid of humor. "You might change your mind soon. Fenwick is full of them. And they are not just lingering spirits, there's something more." Before Mark could ask what he meant, the sound of chains dragging across the floor echoed down the hallway. The noise grew closer, stopping just outside their cell. Mark held his breath, listening, but the sound suddenly vanished, replaced by a chilling silence. He looked over at Carter, who was staring intently at the cell door, his eyes reflecting a knowing fear. Over the next few days, Mark learned the routines of prison life, but the nights were filled with horrors that he could not explain. Inmates whispered about figures seen in the corners of their cells, weeping sounds from empty corridors, and shadows that crept along the walls, watching, always watching. Carter began to speak more, telling Mark about the prison's dark history, of inmates who had vanished without a trace, guards driven mad by unseen forces, and rumors of an ancient evil buried beneath the building's foundations. "Fenwick isn't just a prison," Carter explained one night, his voice barely above a whisper. "It's a gateway, a place where the veil between this world and the next is thin." Mark's skepticism began to waver as the paranormal events escalated. One night, as a fog rolled in from the surrounding moors, the entire cell block was awakened by a horrifying scream. The scream was followed by the sound of someone or something banging on the cell doors. The guards found nothing, but the next morning, one of the inmates was discovered missing, his cell door mysteriously unlocked. As the days turned into weeks, Mark noticed changes in Carter. The hitman grew increasingly paranoid, mumbling to himself and casting fearful glances at the dark corners of their cell. "It's getting stronger," he said one night, his voice trembling. "The barrier is weakening. They want to come through, and they'll use anyone they can." Mark lay awake that night, pondering Carter's words. He felt a growing sense of dread, a feeling that something terrible was about to happen. He didn't have to wait long to find out what it was. The next night, during a thunderstorm similar to the one on his first night, the power in the prison flickered and went out. In the darkness, Mark heard Carter chanting in a language he didn't recognize. The air grew thick, charged with a palpable sense of dread. Shadows danced across the walls, coalescing into the forms of twisted, humanoid figures. As Mark watched in horror, the figures began to move toward Carter, who continued his chanting, his voice rising above the storm outside. The room grew colder, and Mark felt an icy hand grip his heart. He wanted to scream, to run, but he was frozen, unable to move or look away. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, the chanting stopped. The figures vanished, but Carter slumped to the floor, his body still. Mark scrambled to his side, shaking him, but it was too late. Carter was gone, a look of utter terror etched on his face. As the guards rushed in, lights flickering back to life, Mark tried to explain what had happened, but his words sounded like the ramblings of a madman. They moved him to another cell, away from cell block D, but the horror was far from over. In his new cell, the air felt stiflingly heavy, as though saturated with unspoken dread. Mark lay awake night after night, his mind replaying the chilling events. The prison's grim history haunted his thoughts, and the fear that something had been unleashed gnawed at him constantly. Though he was now housed in a different block, the eerie disturbances that had plagued him in cell block D did not cease. In fact, they seemed to intensify. Shadows flickered across his walls with no discernible source, and the chilling sound of distant chains dragging continued to echo through the corridors. Mark's fellow inmates were restless, tormented by unseen forces that seemed empowered by the stormy nights. One particularly stormy evening, as lightning illuminated the sky with violent flashes, a deafening crash echoed through the prison. Startled, Mark jumped to his feet, peering out of his cell bars. Screams and shouts filled the air, adding to the chaos. Guards rushed past, their faces etched with fear and confusion. The source of the commotion soon became horrifyingly clear. The prison chapel, a small, seldom used building within the prison grounds, had partially collapsed. As the dust settled, the inmates whispered about a dark figure seen fleeing the chapel just before the collapse. Some said it was Carter's spirit, cursed to wander the prison. Others spoke of a darker entity, one that had been lurking beneath Fennec for centuries. In the following days, the prison was a hive of whispered theories and rampant fear. Mark felt an oppressive sense of doom. He knew, deep in his bones, that whatever Carter had been involved with, whatever he had tried to do that stormy night, had only begun to reveal its horrifying consequences. As the prison struggled to return to some semblance of order, Mark was approached by an old inmate named Wesley, who had been at Fennec longer than anyone else. Wesley's gaunt face and hollow eyes spoke of decades spent in the shadow of the prison's dark history. "They didn't tell you everything," Wesley whispered, his voice trembling. "This place, it's built on the ruins of something older, something evil. Every few decades, it wakes up, hungry for something it lost long ago." Wesley told Mark about the hidden passages beneath the prison, ancient tunnels that led to a sealed chamber. Carter knew about it, Wesley said. He thought he could control it, use it to escape. But some doors aren't meant to be opened, not ever. Mark listened, his heart pounding with a mix of fear and an inexplicable sense of duty. He needed to find these tunnels, to see for himself what lay beneath Fennec. It was madness, but every fiber of his being told him it was what he had to do. That night, under the cover of darkness and a conveniently timed power outage, Mark followed Wesley's directions to a forgotten section of the old prison laundry. Behind one of the ancient, rusting machines, a loose brick revealed a narrow, descending staircase. Armed with nothing but a flashlight, Mark descended. The air grew cooler and damper as he went deeper, the silence so profound he could hear his own heartbeat. The narrow passageway opened into a larger tunnel system, the walls lined with archaic symbols that seemed to pulse faintly in the beam of his flashlight. The tunnels twisted and turned, a labyrinth beneath the prison. Mark's sense of direction wavered, but he pressed on, driven by a desperate need to understand, to put an end to the nightmare. Finally, he came to a heavy, iron-bound door. It was ancient, the wood swollen and the metal corroded, but it vibrated with a palpable energy. Mark hesitated, his hand on the cold metal. He could feel something on the other side, something powerful and terrifying, waiting. The air around him felt charged, the darkness pressing in. He knew he should turn back, but the pull was too strong. With a deep breath, he pushed the door open. The chamber beyond was vast, the walls carved with intricate, undecipherable runes. In the center, a dark chasm yawned, an abyss so deep that even his flashlight couldn't illuminate its depths. As he stepped closer, the air around the chasm stirred, and a low, menacing growl echoed up from the darkness. The ground trembled, and a cold wind whipped through the chamber, extinguishing his light and plunging him into darkness. Terrified, Mark felt the edge of the abyss mere inches away. He was on the brink, both literally and metaphorically, caught between the known horrors of the prison and the unknown terror that lurked beneath. In the oppressive darkness, Mark felt the ancient presence stirring from the depths of the chasm. The growling intensified, a sound not of this world, resonating with an anger and hunger that chilled him to his core. His heart pounded in his chest, each beat echoing the sinister vibrations emanating from below. Whispers began to fill the chamber, swirling around him like a malevolent wind. They were incoherent at first, a cacophony of voices speaking in a multitude of languages, ancient and modern. As he strained to understand, the voices began to synchronize, forming a clear, terrifying message: return what was taken. Mark staggered backward, his mind racing. What was taken? He thought of the legends Wesley had spoken of, the dark histories and cursed artifacts that were rumored to have been buried beneath the prison. Was something removed from this very chasm? The ground shook violently, jolting him from his thoughts. Cracks spread across the stone floor, the chamber groaning as if in agony. Realizing the danger of his situation, Mark knew he had to escape. He turned to flee, but the way he had come was now blocked by falling debris, sealing him in the dark with the growing rough below. Desperate, he scanned the chamber for another way out. His eyes adjusted to the darkness, revealing faint glimmers of light from small crevices in the walls. One such crevice appeared wider, possibly a narrow passage. Without hesitation, Mark squeezed through the gap, the stone scraping against his skin, drawing blood. The passage was tight and winding, forcing him to crawl. The whispers followed him, now tinged with a mocking tone, as if the unseen entities were amused by his plight. He pushed forward, driven by sheer survival instinct, the narrow walls of the passage amplifying the claustrophobia closing in on him. After what felt like an eternity of crawling in suffocating darkness, the passage finally opened up to another chamber. This one was smaller, the air stale and heavy. At the center of the room was an altar, upon which lay an array of strange objects, old coins, bones, a dagger with a handle shaped like a serpent, and a book bound in human skin. As Mark approached the altar, the temperature in the room dropped sharply. His breath became visible, his exhalations clouding in the frigid air. He inspected the objects, his hands trembling. The book seemed to pulsate with a dark energy, its cover slightly ajar as if inviting him to read its contents. Compelled by a force he couldn't resist, Mark opened the book. The pages were filled with arcane symbols and writings in a language he didn't recognize. As he turned the pages, a sickening realization dawned on him. The book was a catalogue of dark rituals and spells, possibly used by those who had once controlled the ancient power beneath the prison. Suddenly, the chamber filled with a blinding light. The objects on the altar levitated, swirling around him in a spectral dance. The voices crescendoed to a deafening pitch, and the book in his hands flew open to a marked page. The symbols on the page glowed ominously, and an invisible force compelled him to read aloud. With each word he spoke, the ground trembled, and a sense of doom filled the chamber. He tried to stop, but his voice was no longer his own, the ancient incantations controlling him, drawing more power from the abyss below. The chamber shook violently, stones falling from the ceiling, the altar cracking under the strain of the unleashed forces. Mark felt the fabric of reality thinning, the boundary between worlds blurring as something ancient and terrible began to ascend from the depths of the chasm. He knew he had to close the book, to stop the ritual before it was too late, but the power that surged through the chamber was overwhelming, paralyzing him with its intensity. As the chamber continued to shake violently, the walls cracking and groaning under the supernatural stress, Mark felt an indescribable terror taking hold. The air was charged with a roar, ancient power that seemed eager to consume everything within its reach. The words continued to spill from his lips, unwillingly drawn out by the force emanating from the book. Around him, the objects that had been levitating began to spin faster, creating a vortex of spectral energy. The coins, bones, and the serpentine dagger became blurred lines of light, circling around him like a ritualistic dance of the damned. The light from the book's pages cast grotesque shadows on the crumbling walls, shadows that twisted and writhed as if they were alive. Suddenly, a low rumble emanated from the depths of the chasm, growing louder and more menacing. The ground beneath Mark's feet cracked open, forming a fissure that emitted a cold, dark mist. From within this mist, shadows began to form, shapes of beings that were neither human nor animal, their forms vague and shifting, their eyes glowing with a malevolent red light. Mark tried to shut the book, his hands trembling as he struggled against the unseen force that held it open. Each attempt to close the ancient tome was met with resistance, as if the book itself was determined to continue the ritual to its horrific conclusion. The whispers in the chamber grew louder, now clear and commanding, urging him to finish what he had started. Mark's voice faltered, his will fighting against the compulsion to read. He knew that completing the incantation might unleash something that could not be undone, something that could transcend the boundaries of their world with catastrophic consequences. In a desperate bid for control, Mark threw the book across the room. It hit the wall with a force that sent a shockwave through the chamber, momentarily disrupting the vortex of objects. The book fell to the floor, its pages splayed open, still glowing ominously. The rumbling from the chasm intensified, and the beings within the mist started to advance towards Mark, their forms becoming more defined with every step. They were tall and gaunt, with elongated limbs that ended in sharp, talon-like claws. Their faces were devoid of features except for those burning red eyes that seemed to peer into the very soul. Mark backed away, his mind racing for a way to escape. He glanced around the chamber, looking for anything that might help him fend off these creatures. His eyes landed on the serpentine dagger, still spinning in the air amidst the chaos. With a leap of desperate courage, he lunged towards the dagger, grabbing it by the handle. The contact with the dagger sent a jolt through his body, an electric shock that seemed to momentarily clear his mind. Clutching the weapon, he turned to face the advancing shadows. The creatures hesitated, as if recognizing the threat posed by the ancient blade. Mark stood his ground, the dagger raised in a defensive stance. He could feel the power of the dagger pulsating in his hand, a power that had been harnessed and used in countless rituals over the centuries. It was a power that, perhaps, could help him seal the chasm and banish the creatures back to their dark realm. But as he prepared to confront the shadow beings, the fissure in the ground widened, and a more powerful entity began to emerge. This new figure was larger, its presence so overwhelming that the air itself seemed to compress around it. The lesser shadows fell back, bowing to the supremacy of this greater force. Mark knew then that the situation was far more dire than he had imagined. Whatever was coming through the fissure now was the source of the ancient evil, the original darkness that the prison had been built to contain. As this formidable entity continued to rise from the chasm, Mark braced himself for a confrontation that he knew might well be his last. The energy in the chamber escalated, the very walls seeming to pulsate with dark energy, as the boundary between worlds thinned to a near breaking point. The entity that emerged from the chasm was a towering figure shrouded in darkness, its form constantly shifting and writhing as if composed of smoke and shadow. Mark could barely make out the details of its face, but its eyes, a deep, burning crimson, were unmistakably focused on him. The air around it seemed to distort and flicker, as if reality itself struggled to contain its presence. Mark felt the power of the dagger in his hand thrumming, almost in response to the entity's emergence. He knew instinctively that this ancient artifact was the key, possibly the only means of driving the creature back into the depths from which it had come. The entity spoke, its voice a cacophony of whispers that seemed to echo from every corner of the chamber. "You dare to defy the covenant," it boomed, the words resonating inside Mark's skull. "The pact was sealed with blood. Your blood will serve as the last offering." Mark's heart pounded in his chest as he clutched the dagger tighter. "I'm not part of any pact," he shouted back, trying to mask his fear with defiance. "The vessel speaks of defiance," the entity murmured, amusement coloring its tone. It moved closer, each step causing the ground to tremble. "You are but a speck in the cosmos, yet you wield the blade of binding." Curious. Mark could feel the darkness closing in, the shadows cast by the entity stretching towards him like tendrils seeking to ensnare. He knew he couldn't let fear paralyze him, not when so much was at stake. Summoning every ounce of courage he had left, he raised the dagger, pointing it directly at the heart of the shifting shadows. "Your reign ends now," Mark declared, though his voice quivered. The entity paused, its eyes narrowing. The chamber grew colder, the air thick with anticipation. Suddenly, with a roar that shook the very foundations of the prison, the entity lunged at Mark, a blur of darkness and malice. Mark dodged to the side, feeling the air where he had just stood crackle with malevolent energy. He rolled across the cold stone floor, barely managing to regain his footing. The entity turned to face him again, its form expanding and contracting like a breath of the underworld. Knowing he couldn't outrun it, Mark charged forward, driven by desperation. He thrust the dagger into the swirling mass of shadows, feeling it meet resistance. A howl of pain echoed through the chamber, a sound so agonizing and profound it seemed to shake the very soul. The entity recoiled, its form becoming unstable. Shadows leaped from it like smoke, its crimson eyes dimming. "You cannot contain what you do not understand," it gasped, its voice now a mere whisper. Mark stood his ground, the dagger still embedded in the creature. "I don't need to understand," he replied, panting from exertion. "I just need to stop you." As they faced each other in a standoff, the cracks in the floor began to widen, a bright light emanating from below. The light grew in intensity, filling the chamber with a brilliance that contrasted starkly with the surrounding darkness. The entity's form began to dissolve, its shadows evaporating as the light consumed it. It let out one final, pained scream before disappearing completely, leaving behind only the echo of its agony. Mark collapsed to his knees, exhausted and overwhelmed. He looked around the chamber, now silent and bright, the evil presence that had dominated it just moments before now gone. The dagger lay beside him on the ground, its blade cracked and darkened, as if it had absorbed some of the entity's malevolent essence. As he caught his breath, the reality of what he had done began to sink in. He had faced an ancient evil, a force beyond his understanding, and had prevailed. But at what cost? And was it truly over, or had he merely paused an inevitable darkness? The chamber began to stabilize, the light receding into the cracks in the floor, which slowly sealed themselves. The air cleared, becoming breathable again. Mark stood, his legs shaky, and walked towards the sealed fissure, pondering his next move. Mark's gaze lingered on the now sealed fissure, the recent events replaying in his mind like a macabre film. The silence that enveloped the chamber was suffocating, thick with the remnants of dark energy that still lingered in the air, like the fading perfume of a venomous flower. His body ached from the confrontation, each bruise and cut a testament to the nightmarish reality he had endured. With cautious steps, Mark approached the altar where the objects still lay scattered, their previous dance of malevolence ceased. He picked up the serpent-handled dagger, its blade now darkened and slightly cracked, a physical proof of its encounter with the entity. As he held the weapon, a residual coldness seeped into his palm, sending shivers up his arm. Mark wondered if the dagger still harbored some of the entity's energy or if it was merely the metal reacting to the chilling atmosphere of the chamber. Placing the dagger back on the altar, he noticed that the book, the catalyst of this terrifying ordeal, had fallen open to a page different from the one he had read. This page seemed to contain a kind of epilogue to the rituals and incantations he had unwittingly unleashed. The script was difficult to decipher, the language ancient and convoluted, but the drawings were unmistakable, depicting a sequence of sealing and protective rituals, perhaps hinting at a way to ensure the entity would not return. Mark felt a weary responsibility settle upon him. Despite his deep desire to leave this forsaken place and never look back, he knew he couldn't risk the possibility of the darkness re-emerging. With a resigned breath, he began to study the page, trying to memorize the symbols and words that promised a more permanent solution. As he was absorbed in his study, the faint sound of scraping stone echoed through the chamber. His head snapped up, and his hand instinctively reached for the dagger. The sound grew louder, more urgent. Mark's eyes darted around, searching for the source. It seemed to come from behind the walls, a sinister whisper of movement that suggested something, or someone, was there. The atmosphere thickened, a palpable tension building in the air as the scraping continued. Mark's heart raced, his recent battle having left him both physically and emotionally raw. He wasn't sure he could face another confrontation, especially not alone and weakened. Suddenly, the stone floor beneath the altar shifted, revealing a narrow, dark passage that had been hidden underneath. The passage emitted a cold draft, carrying with it a faint odor of decay and the musty scent of long-forgotten secrets. Mark peered down into the darkness, his mind racing with possibilities. Could this be a way out, or was it a deeper delve into the nightmare? His decision was made when he heard noises behind him, the distant sounds of voices and footsteps approaching the chamber. The guards, or worse, the entity's minions, could be on their way to investigate the disturbances. Mark knew he had to move quickly. With the dagger in hand and the book tucked under his arm, he descended into the newly revealed passage. The way was steep and narrow, the walls close enough to touch on either side. As he moved deeper, the light from the chamber above began to fade, soon swallowed by the oppressive darkness of the tunnel. Mark's only guidance was the feel of the cold, damp walls and the slight incline that suggested he was moving downwards. The air grew cooler with each step, the silence so complete he could hear nothing but his own breathing and the steady drip of water from somewhere in the darkness. After what felt like an eternity, the passage finally opened up into a large, underground cavern. The air here was musty but breathable, and faint luminescence from phosphorescent moss cast a dim, eerie glow across the walls. The cavern was vast, the ceiling arching high above, studded with stalactites that resembled the jagged teeth of some gigantic beast. Mark paused, taking in his new surroundings. The cavern might have been beautiful in another context, a natural wonder far below the Earth's surface. But now, it felt like another layer of the dungeon that had trapped him, potentially filled with its own horrors. He could not see the far walls or the end of the cavern, it stretched out into darkness, inviting him to explore deeper. With no other choice, Mark started forward, each step echoing ominously off the stone. His journey was far from over, and the heart of the prison's darkness might still lie ahead. Mark tread carefully across the cavernous floor, the echo of his footsteps a constant reminder of the deep isolation surrounding him. The phosphorescent moss cast ghostly shadows that danced with his every movement, giving the illusion of companionship in a place he suspected was far from uninhabited. As he ventured deeper into the cavern, he began to notice signs that he was not the first to traverse this underground expanse. Faded markings, perhaps left by previous prisoners or by those who had built the prison atop these forgotten depths, painted a chilling picture of past explorations, or perhaps failed escapes. The air grew colder with each step, and the oppressive silence was soon broken by a faint sound that grew steadily louder as he advanced. It was a dripping sound at first, rhythmic and steady, but it soon morphed into a gurgling, as of water churning and bubbling from an unseen source. The source of the sound became apparent as Mark reached a wide, underground river. The water was dark and swift, moving with purpose through the cavern. On the far side of the river, the cavern continued, its walls adorned with more of the eerie luminescent moss and what appeared to be more deliberate markings or symbols. Realizing he needed to cross to continue his exploration and hopeful escape, Mark scanned the area for a way across. His eyes caught sight of a narrow, natural stone bridge arcing precariously over the turbulent waters. With a deep breath, Summoning reserves of courage he wasn't aware he still possessed, Mark approached the bridge. Each step on the stone bridge tested his resolve. The bridge was slick with moisture, and the roaring water below seemed eager to claim him. Halfway across, he paused, feeling the bridge tremble beneath his weight. He could see something on the far side of the river now, something that hadn't been visible from the start of his crossing, a doorway carved into the rock face, a potential exit or perhaps a deeper descent into mystery. As he resumed his cautious trek, the cavern around him began to resonate with a new sound, a low moan that seemed both distant and dreadfully close. The sound grew in intensity, becoming a cacophony of whispers that mirrored those he had heard in the ritual chamber. The voices were disjointed, a mixture of warnings and entreaties, pleas from the countless lost souls who had perhaps once stood where he now stood. Reaching the far side of the river, Mark didn't allow himself to relax. The doorway was adorned with ancient symbols, similar to those he had seen on the ritual altar. He approached, noticing that the door was slightly ajar, a sliver of darkness beckoning him forward. Pushing the door open, Mark stepped into a small chamber. The air was significantly warmer here, and the walls were lined with shelves filled with dusty tomes and artifacts that looked as though they had been undisturbed for centuries. At the center of the room stood a pedestal, upon which rested a single, large book, its cover adorned with a familiar serpentine design. Driven by a mixture of fear and a desperate need for answers, Mark approached the pedestal and opened the book. The pages were filled with descriptions of ancient rituals and spells, many involving the very caverns he now found himself in. One spell, in particular, caught his eye, a sealing spell, said to close the gateways between worlds, potentially sealing away the darkness that had been unleashed. Mark's eyes scanned the pages, memorizing the incantation and the required components. Most were already there in the chamber, as if someone had prepared for this moment long ago, perhaps knowing that one day, someone would need to complete what had been started. With a heavy heart, Mark began to gather the items, preparing to perform the spell. He understood now that this was why he had been drawn here, why he had survived when others might not have. His arrival at Fennec, his encounter with Carter, even his escape into these depths, it all led to this moment. As he set up the ritual, arranging the artifacts in precise alignment as dictated by the ancient tome, the cavern seemed to pulse with energy. The voices grew louder, urging him on. Mark took a deep breath and began to chant the incantation, his voice steady despite the swirling chaos of whispers and moaning winds. The chamber responded, the symbols on the walls glowing with a fierce, otherworldly light. The air grew thick, almost solid with power as Mark continued the spell. He could feel the energy converging on him, the fate of many resting on his shoulders. With the final word of the incantation spoken, a blinding light filled the chamber, and a shockwave of energy burst forth, shaking the very foundation of the cavern. Then, as quickly as it had begun, the light receded, the air cleared, and the oppressive presence that had filled the depths was gone. Mark stood alone in the silent chamber, the book closed at his feet. The gateway was sealed, the darkness held at bay once more. Exhaustion swept over him like a wave, but beneath it was a profound relief. He had faced unimaginable horrors and had come out victorious, though not unscathed. The shadows of Fennec Penitentiary and its underground secrets would linger in his mind, perhaps forever. Mark picked up the ancient tome, its cover no longer pulsating with ominous energy, and placed it carefully back on the pedestal. He looked around the chamber, now just a room filled with relics of a bygone era, its threat neutralized yet still resonating with a history of dark rituals and desperation. The silence was absolute, a stark contrast to the cacophony of voices and supernatural tumult that had filled the caverns just moments before. Mark realized he was finally alone, truly alone, and the solitude felt both eerie and immensely peaceful. He made his way back to the river, crossing the stone bridge with more confidence this time, its surface no longer slippery with the mist of dark energies. Reaching the other side, he followed the tunnel back up towards the prison, each step taking him closer to the surface world he had left behind. As he ascended, the darkness of the tunnel gradually gave way to the dim light of dawn, filtering in through distant, grime-covered windows. The prison, a place of confinement and shadowy corners, seemed different now. It was still a prison, but the oppressive, haunting presence was gone. It felt like just a building now, old and decrepit, a relic of the past, much like the items in the underground chamber. Mark emerged into the prison yard as the sun rose fully above the horizon, casting long, golden rays across the walls. The air was fresh, crisp with the morning chill, and he took deep, grateful breaths. The nightmare was over, the darkness contained, and life could begin anew. In the weeks that followed, Mark's story, incredible as it was, would be met with skepticism and disbelief. But those within Fennec who had experienced the disturbances knew the truth. Changes came to the prison, spurred by the unexplainable events and Mark's testimony. Investigations were launched, old records examined, but no official explanation could be found. Eventually, the worst parts of the prison, including the condemned cell block D, were closed off, sealed much like the darkness beneath them. Mark was released from Fennec Penitentiary a year later, his sentence quietly commuted. He left behind the echoes of his former cellmate and the shadows of the underground, carrying with him the memories of his ordeal. He wrote a book about his experiences, a detailed account that became a bestseller, pored over by skeptics and believers alike. Mark didn't mind the debates and the disbelief. He knew what he had faced, he knew what he had overcome. He had looked into the abyss, and though it had gazed back into him, he had emerged not just surviving but thriving. Years later, Fennec Penitentiary would be demolished, a new facility built far from the cursed grounds. But the stories of Fennec and its dark past lived on, whispered tales of a prisoner who faced an ancient evil and won. 44444 Mark often looked back on those days, reflecting on the fear, the darkness, and his journey into the heart of it all. And in his quietest moments, he could still hear the faintest whispers of the cavern, a reminder that some doors, once opened, never fully close.